They say a man's greatest mistake is not what he loses, but what he trusts. John spent over 46 years in the UK, working in silence, surviving in loneliness, and building a life he thought would one day return to his children in Nigeria. But everything changed the day he made one decision. But here's the question. How does a man lose everything? Not through violence, not through war, but through trust. And more importantly, what happens when the wrong person learns your name better than you do? If you stay until the end of this story, you'll understand how one decision destroyed a lifetime and left a father with nothing but regret. But before we discover what happened next, please like and share and also comment where you are watching from. Now sit down well, let's begin. If you asked anyone on John Street in Peckham who he was, they would tell you the same thing. A quiet man, keeps to himself, always greeting though. And it was true. John greeted everyone. "Morning, morning," he would say, even when it was clearly afternoon. "Evening, my brother," even to people who had never once replied. It wasn't that he didn't notice their indifference. He did. But a man who had spent 46 years in a foreign land learns quickly. Acknowledgement is a luxury. Survival is the priority. John had survived. Not in the loud, boastful way some men did. No flashy cars, no big houses in London, but in the quiet, stubborn way of someone who refused to disappear. He worked jobs that never introduced him properly. Cleaner, driver, night porter, sometimes all three in the same week. Yet back in Nigeria, John was something else entirely. There, he was Daddy London, a title heavier than any crown. Every month, without fail, money would travel across continents like a faithful messenger. School fees? Paid. Roof leaking? Fixed. Hospital bill? Settled before anyone even finished worrying. John never missed. Even when it meant eating bread and tea for 3 days straight. Even when winter felt like punishment and his heater refused to cooperate. Even when loneliness sat beside him like an uninvited guest that never left. Still, he sent money. Because somewhere in Nigeria, 4 children were growing up with his name. Michael, Junior, Paul, Sharon. He knew them the way you know a song you haven't heard in years, familiar but slightly out of reach. On this particular evening, London wore its usual expression, gray, damp, and uninterested in anyone's feelings. John stood by his window, holding a small, slightly bent photograph. 4 children, 1 woman, and a version of himself that looked younger, stronger, certain. He chuckled softly. Look at me. I thought I knew everything. His finger rested gently on Sharon's face in the photo, his only daughter, the one who smiled as if life had personally promised her something good. "She is married now," he said to the empty room. Then, after a pause, "And I was not there." The words didn't sound bitter, just factual. But something about them stayed in the air longer than they should have. In Nigeria, Sharon was the kind of person people described using soft words. Gentle, respectful. That girl no get wahala. Even when there was wahala, Sharon had a way of smoothing it over like it never existed. If her brothers fought, she settled it. If her mother worried, she reassured her. If money was tight, she quietly adjusted. She was the bridge in a house full of different personalities. And maybe that was why John loved her. Just a little differently. Not more, but differently. The day she told her family she was getting married, the house did not sleep. Junior shouted, "Who is the man? We must investigate." Paul just sat quietly, already suspicious of life in general. Michael nodded like a responsible elder, even though he had no idea what was going on. And Sharon? She just laughed. His name is Andrew. Andrew. The name entered the house like a visitor who removed his shoes at the door, polite, careful, well-presented. When he finally came in person, even the air seemed to approve of him. Clean clothes, straight posture, measured speech. "My name is Andrew, sir," he said to Sharon's mother. "It's an honor." Ah, that word, honor. Nigerian parents have fallen for less. But Andrew was more than polite. He was attentive. He listened to when others spoke. He smiled at the right moments. He never interrupted. And most importantly, he understood something many people overlook. People don't just listen to what you say. They watch how you say it. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Andrew lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His expression had changed. The softness was gone. In its place was something sharper, quieter, calculating. 46 years, he whispered to himself. He had heard the stories. John, the father in London, the man who had built a life abroad, a life that existed on paper. Andrew turned his head slightly, a faint smile forming. "Some people build things," he said softly, "and some people step into them." The phone call came on a Sunday. It was always Sunday, as if distance respected routine. "Daddy?" Sharon's voice came through, warm and alive. John sat up straighter than he had all week. "My daughter." There are some words that don't need decoration. That was one of them. They spoke about everything and nothing. Weather, food, neighbors that John didn't know, and problems he couldn't see. But underneath it all, something was building. John could feel it. That quiet pressure that comes before a decision finally introduces itself. "Daddy, you were not at my wedding," Sharon said gently. It wasn't accusation. It was observation. Still, it landed heavily. John cleared his throat. "Yes, I know." Silence followed. Then, slowly, carefully, like someone placing something fragile on a table, "I want you to come to the UK." On the other end, Sharon froze. Even the background noise seemed to pause. "Me?" she asked. "Yes, you and your husband." If excitement had a sound, it would have been what came next. Sharon's laughter filled the line, bright and uncontrollable. "Daddy, are you serious?" John smiled, though no one could see it. "Yes." In the background, Andrew stepped closer. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And in that moment, something invisible shifted. A door opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. John leaned back in his chair after the call ended. For years, he had said no. It is not time. Life here is not easy. Let me prepare first. But now he had said yes. He looked at the old photograph again. Then, slowly, he shook his head. Michael would have managed well here, he murmured. Junior, that one would stress me." A small chuckle escaped him. "And Paul, quiet boy." He paused. Then, softer. "But Sharon," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Some decisions don't come from logic. They come from feeling. And feelings do not always ask permission from the future. The airport was loud, busy, alive with movement. But in the middle of it all, John stood still, clutching his cap, adjusting it unnecessarily, waiting. Then he saw her. "Daddy!" Sharon ran toward him, her cream sweater flowing slightly behind her, her face lit with something pure and unfiltered. John opened his arms, and just like that, 46 years of distance folded into one moment. Andrew approached more slowly, wearing a light blue button-up shirt neatly tucked into dark trousers, polished shoes reflecting the airport lights. "Sir," he said, extending his hand. John looked at him, then smiled. "Welcome." It was a simple exchange, but something about it settled things too quickly, too smoothly, like a story skipping a page it shouldn't. That night, in John's small apartment, the three of them sat together. Sharon talked. She filled the room with life. But Andrew? Andrew watched. He noted everything: the layout, the documents, the habits, and most importantly, the man. John noticed none of it, because when you finally receive what you have missed for years, you rarely question how it arrived. The first week passed like a well-rehearsed play. Everyone smiled. Everyone adjusted. Everyone pretended. John woke up early, as always. Some habits don't retire, even when a man should. He moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing tea, occasionally glancing toward the small room where Sharon and Andrew slept. A small smile sat on his face. "My house is full," he whispered. For a man who had spent years speaking mostly to silence, even the sound of someone turning in their sleep felt like a celebration. Andrew noticed everything, not loudly, not obviously, but carefully. On the third day, he asked his first real question. "Sir, how long have you been working here?" John chuckled. Since before you were thinking of marriage." Andrew smiled politely. "I mean, your documents, your status." "Ah, that." John waved his hand dismissively. "It took time, many years, but now everything is settled." Andrew nodded slowly. "Everything." He repeated the word like someone testing its weight. That night, while Sharon slept, Andrew sat at the small table with a notebook. He had drawn columns: income, expenses, opportunities. Then at the top of the page, he wrote one word: John. He stared at it for a long time, then leaned back. 46 years, he muttered, just sitting here. There is a particular kind of silence that comes when a person begins to believe something is wasted, and Andrew had started to believe. It started gently, almost respectfully. "Sir," Andrew said one evening, sitting upright, his tone careful, "I've been thinking." John looked up from his tea. Andrew leaned forward slightly. "You have done a lot, truly, for your family, for Sharon." John nodded, pleased, but slightly uncomfortable. "You don't need to say all that." "No, I do," Andrew insisted softly, "because not many men would sacrifice like this." Sharon nodded immediately. "It's true, Daddy." Andrew paused, then continued. "But now things can be easier." John frowned slightly. "Easier?" "Yes, you don't have to carry everything anymore. I am here now." There was something in the way he said it, something reassuring, something convenient. "You see," Andrew continued, lowering his voice slightly, "with the right arrangement, I can handle certain responsibilities: work, documents, movement." John watched him closely now. The words were clean, but the meaning was still forming. Sharon smiled, unaware of the shape of the conversation. "That would help, Daddy. You've done enough already." John leaned back slowly. For years, he had carried everything alone. Responsibility had become part of his identity. To release it felt unnatural, but also tempting. "What kind of arrangement?" John asked. Andrew's eyes flickered briefly. There it was, the door, now fully open. The room was unusually quiet that night. Even the usual sounds, the pipes, the distant traffic, seemed to step back. On the table sat documents, passports, papers, identity in physical form. John adjusted his glasses, looking down at them. "You must understand," he said slowly, "this is not something small." Andrew nodded. "I understand." But his voice didn't carry hesitation. It carried certainty. "If anything goes wrong," John began. "It won't," Andrew interrupted gently. Then, correcting himself, "we will be careful." Sharon sat nearby, her hands clasped together. She didn't fully understand the depth of what was happening, but she trusted both men, and sometimes that is enough to allow something irreversible. John picked up the passport. His name stared back at him, a name that had worked, suffered, survived. He looked at Andrew. "You will take care of everything?" Andrew met his gaze. Yes. No pause. No doubt. John nodded slowly. Then, with a movement so simple it almost felt harmless, he passed it over. Somewhere in that moment, something invisible shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Andrew took the passport, and for the first time, he held John's life in his hands. At first, nothing changed. That was the trick. Andrew remained polite, helpful, presentable, but small things began to move, quietly. "Sir, I will handle this payment." "Sir, no need, I've sorted it." "Sir, just rest." John noticed the pattern, but interpreted it differently. "My son-in-law is responsible," he said one evening, smiling to himself. "But responsibility can evolve." Weeks passed. Then, one day, "Sir, this month is tight," Andrew said casually, adjusting his cufflinks. John looked up. "Tight?" "Yes, expenses, you know. London is not easy." John nodded slowly. "That is true." Another week, another excuse. "Next month will be better." It wasn't. The money stopped. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a tap being turned off one drop at a time. And then the tone changed. "Sharon, I said leave it." The words cut through the room sharply. John looked up immediately. That was not Andrew's usual voice. Sharon stood still, holding a plate. "I was just trying to help." "I didn't ask for help," Andrew snapped. Silence fell. Heavy. Unfamiliar. John cleared his throat. "My son," Andrew turned, and for a brief moment, there was no respect in his eyes, just irritation. "It's handled," Andrew said flatly. John leaned back slowly. Something had changed, and this time, it was not small. Later that night, Sharon sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Her bright clothes had already begun to fade into softer tones, not because she planned it, but because her energy had. "He didn't used to speak like that," she said softly. John sat beside her. "No," he agreed. Then, after a pause, "Sometimes power speaks differently when it becomes comfortable." Sharon didn't fully understand, but she felt it. Andrew stood by the window, adjusting his black suit. The transformation was complete. Gone was the man in light blue shirts and soft smiles. In his place stood someone sharper, colder, certain. He looked at his reflection. "Everything is in place," he said quietly. Behind him, the apartment was silent. Too silent. John had started asking questions, carefully, but consistently. And questions are dangerous when answers are inconvenient. Andrew picked up his phone, dialed, waited. "Yes," he said when the line connected. "I need to report something." His voice was calm, measured, convincing. "There is a man living under false identity." He paused, then added, "He has been stealing." Outside, London moved as it always did, unaware, uninterested. Inside, a decision had just been sealed. Andrew lowered the phone slowly, then exhaled. "Better to move first," he murmured, because in his mind, there was no longer space for two men named John. It was early, too early for visitors, too early for problems, but problems rarely check the time. Knock, knock, knock. Firm, official, unfriendly. John looked up from his chair, his cup of tea halfway to his lips. He frowned. Who was that by this time? Sharon stepped out of the room, tying her wrapper loosely. "I'll check." Another knock. Louder. Andrew was already awake, dressed, not in his usual house clothes, but in a crisp shirt and dark trousers, prepared. "I'll get it," he said calmly. Something about that didn't sit right. But the moment moved too quickly for anyone to hold on to that feeling. The door opened. Two officers stood outside, serious faces, clipboards in hand. "Good morning," one said. "We received a report." Andrew stepped aside slightly. "Please come in." John stood slowly. "A report? About what?" The officer glanced at his paper, then at John, then back again. "Sir, we have reason to believe you are living under false identity." The room shifted, not physically, but something in the air dropped. John blinked. What?" Andrew folded his arms quietly, standing slightly behind the officers now, watching. "There are also allegations of theft," the officer continued. John let out a small, confused laugh. "Theft? Me?" He looked around the room as if someone else might claim the accusation. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us." Sharon stepped forward immediately. No, there must be a mistake. This is my father." The officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, we are acting on a formal report." John turned slowly. His eyes met Andrew's. And in that moment, understanding arrived. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. "You?" John said quietly. Andrew didn't answer. He didn't need to. The station smelled like paperwork and decisions already made. John sat across from two officers, his hands resting on the table. Steady, too steady. "State your name," one of them said. John opened his mouth, then paused. For 46 years, that question had been the simplest thing in the world. Now, it felt complicated. "Jean," he said finally. The officer glanced at the file, then shook his head slightly. "That's not what we have here." A photograph was placed on the table. Andrew, but under the name, Jean. Jean stared at it, then leaned back slowly. "So, that is how it is," he murmured. "Sir, if you cooperate—" "I am cooperating," Jean said calmly. There was no anger in his voice, just something heavier, something settled. I gave him that name, he added. The officers exchanged a glance. That's not how identity works, one said. Jean almost smiled. Yes, he replied softly. I am beginning to understand that. Back at the apartment, silence had taken over. Sharon sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. Her gray sweater hung loosely on her frame. She hadn't noticed when her bright clothes stopped appearing. Andrew moved around the house as if nothing had changed, because in his mind, nothing had. Why? Sharon finally asked. Her voice was small, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Andrew didn't turn. Why what? She stood up. Why would you do that to my father? Andrew adjusted his watch. Still calm, still composed. He made a mistake, he said. Sharon stared at him. A mistake? Yes, Andrew finally turned to face her. He gave away something he didn't know how to protect. That's your explanation? She whispered. Andrew stepped closer. His voice lowered, controlled. This is how life works. You either hold what you have, or someone else will. Sharon shook her head slowly, tears forming. That is my father. Andrew's expression didn't change. And now, he said, he is a man without proof. The process was fast, too fast for a man who had spent decades building something. Documents were reviewed, statements recorded, but the truth had no paperwork. Andrew's version was clean, clear, supported. John's version, it sounded like a story. And systems do not run on stories. They run on evidence. Given the circumstances, the officer said, you will be deported. John nodded slowly. No shouting, no begging, just acceptance. 46 years, he said quietly. The officer hesitated slightly, but only for a moment. I'm sorry, he replied, but the words didn't carry weight. They never do in rooms like that. Sharon stood outside the building when they brought John out. Daddy! She ran toward him, her gray dress moving with urgency. John smiled when he saw her. A small smile, but real. Ah, my daughter, he said. She held him tightly. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. John placed a hand gently on her head. It's not everything you must understand, he said softly. She pulled back, tears running freely. Come back, she whispered. John looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. Some journeys you don't return from the same way. Behind them, Andrew stood at a distance, wearing a black suit, watching, not involved, not affected, just present. The divorce papers came like everything else Andrew did. Clean, direct, final. Sharon sat at the table, staring at the document. Her name looked unfamiliar beside his. Sign, Andrew said simply. She looked up at him, searching for something, anything, but there was nothing left to find. You planned all this, she said. Andrew adjusted his sleeve. He prepared, he replied. There was a difference, at least to him. Sharon picked up the pen. Her hand trembled slightly. Then she signed, and just like that, another tie was cut. The plane did not feel like a journey. It felt like a return that had been forced too soon. John sat by the window, his hands resting quietly on his lap. The same hands that had worked for decades now looked unfamiliar to him. Not weaker, just empty. Beside him, a man who was going back to Nigeria. He had said very little since he heard John's story. What words could he use? Welcome back? Sorry? Why? None of them fit. John looked out of the window as clouds drifted slowly beneath him. When I first came, he said, quietly, almost to himself, I was afraid. The man glanced at him. And now? He asked. John paused, then gave a small, almost amused exhale. Now, he said, I understand what fear actually is. The plane moved forward, but for John, it felt like everything had already stopped. The house in Nigeria was exactly as he had left it. Strong, painted, standing with quiet pride. It had not suffered. It had not struggled. It had not waited. Only the people inside it had. Daddy is back! The voice came from outside before John even stepped fully into the compound. Junior appeared first, as expected, energy before thought. Daddy! He rushed forward, stopping just short of hugging him too tightly, as if unsure what version of his father had returned. Michael followed, slower, measured. Paul stood behind them, silent, observing. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then John smiled, not wide, but enough. My sons, he said, and just like that, the years between them rearranged themselves into something manageable. That evening, they sat outside. The air was warm, still, honest. No London noise, no rushing, just space. Junior was the first to speak. Daddy, what happened? It was direct, but not careless. John leaned back in his chair. He looked at each of his sons, one by one. Then he shook his head slightly. A decision, he said. Michael frowned. What kind of decision sends a man back like this? John smiled faintly. The kind you believe is right, until it is not. Silence settled again, but this time it was heavier. Paul finally spoke. His voice was quiet. You could have brought us. The words did not accuse. They did not attack. They simply existed. John's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Yes, he said. Nothing more. Because anything more would have been unnecessary. Days passed. Slowly. John adjusted to Nigeria again, but not in the way people expected. He did not complain. He did not explain. He did not defend himself. He simply existed. Every evening, he sat outside as the sun lowered itself into the horizon. The same position, the same silence. Sometimes one of his sons would sit with him. Sometimes none of them would. But John was always there, watching, thinking. Regret is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It just stays. One evening, Michael joined him. They sat side by side, watching the sky turn orange. You built something there, Michael said. John nodded. And you gave it away. John nodded again. Michael exhaled slowly. Why him? That question lingered longer than the others. John leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Because, he said slowly, I thought I was choosing love. Michael didn't respond. Because he understood. And that made it heavier. Back in London, life continued. Andrew moved freely, confidently. The name fit him now. comfortably. He walked into places without hesitation, spoke without doubt, lived without interruption. The system recognized him. In systems, do not revisit decisions once they are filed away. In his apartment, everything was in order, clean, sharp, controlled. But sometimes, late at night, when the city grew quiet, Andrew would pause. Not for long, not enough to change anything, but just enough to feel the silence. Back in Nigeria, the sun set like it always had. Consistent, unbothered. John sat in his usual place, wearing a simple dark green agbada, his cap resting neatly on his head. His sons were nearby, not speaking, just present. The air carried no questions now, no confusion, only understanding. "I had 4 sons," John said suddenly. The words caught their attention. Then he corrected himself. "I have 4 children." He paused. "But I gave my life to someone who was not among them." No one interrupted, because there was nothing to interrupt. The truth had already settled. John looked out into the distance. He continued, "I thought I was helping the future." Then, softer, "I did not see that I was removing it from where it belonged." The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched, and in that moment, everything that needed to be understood was. A man can spend a lifetime building something and lose it in a moment, not because he had nothing, but because he gave everything to the wrong hands. Sometimes the greatest danger is not the enemy you see, but the trust you give without thinking. Love and sacrifice are powerful, but when they are placed in the wrong hands, they can destroy what took a lifetime to build. Opportunities should be given with wisdom, not just emotion, because once a choice is made, not even years of sacrifice can always repair it. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. See you in the next video. Bye.